Welcome to the International Conference of Secular Alcoholics Anonymous from Toronto, Canada, August 24th to August 26th, 2018.
I got the pleasurable job of introducing our next speaker here. Ray came to our meeting about a year and a half ago, or just a year ago. We met him then, and actually he was well known in the community, in the community. My wife and I had just moved to White Rock 3 years ago. So we soon found that Ray's group in White Rock was called As You Are. And they had started this group about 30 some odd years ago because they didn't like all the hard and fast rules of AA at the time. A very interesting group of people. I was on the planning committee for the last regional conference in Tacoma, and we were looking for a speaker. And I soon thought that Ray would be a good candidate. So we took a little trip to Seattle, talked to the rest of the planning committee, Willow in the group, and he was hired on. So he came to our conference, and I just can only say he knocked socks off, mine in particular. I'm very grateful to have my friend in recovery and to hear him speak again.
Everybody, I'm Ray. I'm an alcoholic. Ken introduced himself to me as an apatheist. You know what that is? Apatheist, that's don't know, don't care. Before you decide whether you want to listen to me, I'll first qualify as a physician in addiction medicine. I'm not a circuit speaker, although I love AA and I've been going to meetings sober for 32 years. I don't speak a lot in AA, but I do a fair bit of addiction medicine speaking. I've recently retired after a 30-year career of addiction medicine. Before that, I was a family doctor for 12 years, delivering babies, doing house calls. I wrote a chapter in a Con's Current Therapy, a medical text on alcoholism. I was on the board of the American Society of Addiction Medicine for 4 years. I put the addiction medicine curriculum in place, designed it and directed it at the University of British Columbia between 1990 and 95. And I'm currently writing a book called Recovery Medicine. The book, like its author, is a work in progress. It may never get done. And the other thing about this, I'm going to talk a little bit about neurobiology, and as a struggling alcoholic undergraduate, practicing drinking, drugging alcoholic in fourth year at the University of Western Ontario, I was studying honors biology, honors physiology, and I was studying the physiology of reward in rats, which I thought was kind of fitting because that's the same stuff we hear so much about. And I've remained avidly involved ever since in studying, first of all, practically, and secondly, then keeping up with the literature. We'll talk a little bit more about that. To qualify as an alcoholic, I was one of those people who, I wasn't a stereotypical alcoholic. I really didn't qualify. I didn't have strong genetic background, and I didn't have a lot of bad things happen to me. I was much loved as a kid. Something happened in adolescence that I started feeling like an outsider, and I was a risk taker. And my addiction dates back to probably when I was 16 in a small Eastern Ontario community. My parents were seeing what was happening to me, and they thought they'd get me away from the bad influence. But they didn't know as I was the bad influence. They moved me to Toronto, and within 2 weeks I was in the Don jail for my first impaired driving charge as a 17-year-old. I ended up, this town, Toronto, became important in my alcoholic career because I dropped out of school while I was here, and I soldered wires for Bell Canada here. I had a supervisor. I would go in every morning, hungover, ride my Harley, and he took me aside one day and said, "Ray, you're not very good at soldering wires. I saw your aptitude test. Take the summer off and go back to school." And I did. And he changed my life because I went back to school and I figured out how to get top marks. My addiction continued, but I still fell upstairs. So I won science prizes. I won honors physiology gold medal, and then I was the class valedictorian in medical school, despite the fact that I was a practicing addict, alcoholic. And not too atypical. I've met a lot of docs like myself, but only one really bad thing happened to me, and that was when in 1976, after I finished my medical training, my internship, we went out west, and so I was about 3 months a doc when I got a call from Department of External Affairs in Ottawa, and they said, "Your parents were traveling in India. They got sick. They went on with their group to Nepal. They're now in hospital. Can you try to get them out?" And here I am, 3 months as a doc. So I go around the world riding my white Charger to try to save their lives. And they were really sick. I spent 2 months over there, and Dad died in Nepal. And I got Mom back here to Mount Sinai, and she died here. And it was on me. I took responsibility. So what did I do? I went back to work within a week and worked hard, drank hard, drugged hard for the next 10 years and never grieved it. And so November of 1984, I walked out the back door of my office. I'd been living one day at a time for a while at that point, knowing if it got any worse, it couldn't get worse because I would end it. And I didn't know what was wrong. I didn't know it was addiction. I didn't have words for the feelings, but it actually was a relief to know it couldn't get any worse. And I ended up going to a treatment center here at the Donwood. And I spent Christmas there. I missed my first day because I got drunk at YVR Airport and missed my plane from Vancouver. And luckily they let me come in, but it was weekend. There was no programming here. All that happened was there was an AA group meeting on Saturday night. So they let me out of Happy Valley, the detox end, where they didn't let me have my pills or my belt or my shoelaces for some reason. Anyway, and I went to this meeting and I was kind of toxic. And so I don't really remember anything they said, but I was ready and I wanted what they had. And I brought this book back to my detox bed. I bought a big book. And at that point, I was, if you remember transactional analysis, I'm okay, you're okay. Well, I'm not okay, you're not okay. I was a rabid cynic. If I worshipped anything, it was science, but even that was cynical. And so, but I was hungry. I got a taste. I wanted what these guys had, and I hadn't gotten far in the book before I thought, oh shit. And luckily, I had enough of a sense of humor to realize the ridiculousness of that. I mean, I was in a position I couldn't be a chooser. So I hate to admit it to this group, and I'm kind of afraid you might vote me off the island when I say this. But when I did it, I closed the door. I was embarrassed. I thought I was being a total hypocrite. And I had one of those things happen to me. And it was a big deal. And then over the next several days, I had some remarkable coincidences that happened. Incredibly unlikely things happened. And I was on fire. I came home on fire. And I loved AA. And my wife thought I was insane, but she thought, well, at least he's better than he was. So, Agnes. I went through a religious quest. I went to a whole bunch of different churches and faked it. And for a while I thought I had it. And then gradually, I did that for about 10 years. And I got pretty good at faking it until I couldn't anymore. And then I stopped doing that. And I started moving towards more of Eastern sort of not a generic quest. And I'm still doing that. I know less about religion and spirituality, the details, than I did then, but I'm more and more comfortable with it. So I just have to say, you know, there was a Groucho Marx thing that he said, I'd never go to a party of the kind of people that invite me for a party. Well, I would never believe in a God that I could understand. So, I mean, I think it's more complex than that. But I certainly believe in something, in spiritual. I don't know what you'd call me, but I'm comfortable with it. So, like it or not, that's what you got. The top picture is myself and Agnes, taken May 2nd. That's our 48th anniversary. Every anniversary, we ride our bikes 20 kilometers to Tawasin and have lunch and then ride them back around the Mud Bay Dam. And the picture below it is me qualifying for the Worlds in the long course triathlon. And this past year, I ran it. I qualified for the Worlds, and I got silver for my age group, so second in the world. Now, it's like, how do you become an old timer in AA? That's don't drink and don't die. Well, it's the same with triathlon. That's the 70 to 74-year-old age category, but still, it was good. So, 48 years married, 32 years sober. I'm retired and absolutely loving it, and life continues to get better. In this talk, we're going to talk about addiction recovery and a little bit of look at the science of spirituality as measured through outcome studies. Be careful when people show you pictures about the brain and neurobiology. Be real careful, because one of my guru expert neurobiology friends, he's died, but he said, saying you understand what goes on neurobiologically with addiction is sort of like sampling the sewers beneath Moscow and telling people that you know what they had for breakfast in Moscow. It's really, really complex. But I like the definition of addiction John Bradshaw had. It's pathological relationship, mood-altering activities with life-damaging consequences. Fits for everything. This is addiction, okay? Now, the next one is ASAM, the American Society of Addiction Medicine, but this is addiction. Notice they don't say the drug, alcohol, they don't say booze, they don't say cocaine. It's a primary, which means it's not secondary to something else. There isn't an underlying problem. There might be risk factors, there might be emotional trauma or psychiatric things. You may have started drinking, you may have many risk factors, but it's a primary disease, just like diabetes. Primary chronic disease of the brain, reward, motivation, memory, and related circuitry. Dysfunction in these circuits leads to characteristic biological, psychological, social, and spiritual manifestations. This is reflected on individuals pathologically pursuing reward and or relief by substance use and other behaviors. It kind of works for me. There are at least 8 for the drug alcohol, which is one of the dirty drugs that I've ever treated. You know, heroin and cocaine are much cleaner drugs than the drug alcohol, because alcohol uses probably 8 different neurotransmitter and neuroreceptor mechanisms, and it involves many, many parts of the brain, and we don't begin to understand them all. Sure, dopamine's part of it, and endorphin's part of it, and GABAergic receptors, and it's just really complicated. I used to just pray that my medical colleagues would finally wake up and see this was a disease. And I've gotten my wish, and I've lived to regret it a little bit. Because calling it a disease of the brain, what does that lead to? It leads to, right, it's reductionism. It leads to saying, oh, it's like depression. There's a deficit in dopamine or mu receptor agonists. All we have to do is give them drug, and it's beware of reductionism. Whether the reductionism is saying everybody with addiction has emotional trauma, well, many of them do, some of them don't. Or reductionism is just really dangerous, because what it leads to is the locked steel cage of certainty. And whether that's in an AA meeting and it's fundamentalist, or if it's somebody that's saying all addiction is due to being disenfranchised, or anytime you hear somebody say, this is what addiction is, it's this one thing you know for sure, they're wrong. Okay, because it's, and if you like things black and white, yeah, this is a bad field, because this addiction is, you have to be okay with plurality. So addiction is physical, cognitive, social, and you can't read these, but there are many physical changes. Probably the single greatest risk of addiction is genetics. But then with using drugs like alcohol or any psychoactive drug chronically, you can get epigenetic changes. That's changes in the expression, the genetic expression from the DNA and the protein synthesis. Long-term use of the drug causes these changes that are kind of permanent, only partially reversible, and somewhat transmissible, which gets really spooky with epigenetics. And so, and all of the organ systems that are involved, when you have this disease, you can get permanently damaged, not just brain, but just about every tissue in your body. Cognitively, it affects the whole brain, the cerebral cortex, the cerebellum, all parts of it. So your executive function changes. So your personality, your thinking changes, and especially with the drug alcohol, which makes it really interesting working in this field. You know, the person who comes through my door raging, intoxicated, is not the same person 2 years later, as we've all seen in this room. It's very addictive working in this field, because we get to see miracles. Behavioral, some reductionists would say this is a behavior, and it's true, it is a behavior, and that's why aversive conditioning and other behavioral approaches, rewards, contingency management, are somewhat effective, because it's largely a behavior. But if you reduce it simply to behavior, you're wrong. It's a lot more than behavior. But does behavioral treatments work? Yeah, they do. Social in cause, social in manifestation. Isolation, hanging around with people that make me feel okay. Changes in my social behaviors. It used to be that psychiatrists would say that the comorbidity of most alcoholics is antisocial personality disorder. They don't say that anymore. I mean, in our drinking, our behavior was very antisocial. Didn't mean we had that personality. And finally, spiritual, that self-hatred, nihilism, shame, emptiness, and the cognitive dissonance, that when my values are up here and my behavior's way down here, that gap is what the shame that I feel, the feeling bad. This is just a squiggle from the left. Jelinek did a much better job on it, but from the left of the abstinence of 1/5 of the population doesn't drink or smoke or do other drugs. 60 to 65% can use recreational. Did anybody see Lancet this week? August 23rd. Really exciting for the people in this room. What it showed was that with corrected epidemiological studies, when you go back and look at morbidity and mortality for alcohol, guess what the safe level of alcohol consumption is? Zero. There is none. And that's new. And what's going to be really interesting with all these people who say they're evidence-based is how they're going to change their story now, because we know they're not going to change their drinking, you know. Maybe it's the same way, Justin Trudeau dealt with marijuana, you know, said, well, look at the science, but then they looked at the science, but it didn't really affect their decision making. And that's the pickle line. To the right of the line, you're a pickle. To the left of the line, you're a cucumber. The important point there is once you're over the line, going back isn't likely. But, I hate to say it, there's a small, significant percentage who regain control. Hate to say it. And you could say, oh, they weren't real alcoholics. Okay. I like this image of kintsugi, the Japanese art of broken pottery, where you end up with something that's more beautiful and stronger than before it was broken. I identify strongly with that. The most fortunate thing in my life was that I qualified for this diagnosis, because I was so screwed. How would I have ever gotten well if I didn't meet the criteria for addiction? So, in 1990, this grassroots recovery movement got started. And we started, rather than looking at pathological problem, the disease, or treating it like an acute disorder, let's look at the phenomenon recovery. We hadn't done any research on it. There was lots of research on the disease, nothing on recovery, believe it or not. And we were treating it like an acute disorder. So if you're going to measure it, if you're going to do research, you have to be able to define it. So what is recovery? Well, the Betty Ford Institute, SAMHSA, a number of organizations around the world have come up with definitions of addiction. The Canadian Centre on Substance Abuse, the Life in Recovery Survey, which I was fortunate enough to be part of the administration, designed and administration. We also canvassed Canadians in recovery for the definitions. And there are four common things that you find. The first is there's a pursuit of abstinence. Now, abstinence means abstinent from addictive behavior. So if you're a food addict, that means eating according to a plan without having addictive behavior, without the binges and the purges and so some would say is with medication-assisted treatments, it allows a person to meet the criteria for abstinence as long as there's no addictive behavior. For me, I like the word pursuit because my recovery began in 1984. I didn't have my last use of substances till February the 6th, 1986, when my heart stopped with a needle in my arm with some really high-grade medical cocaine. And for me, that's what had to happen. And it's what convinced me to do whatever it took. Recovery got really easy after that, you know. It really did. My sponsor, if he had said, stand on your head in the closet, that's what I would have done. And it got real easy. So the second thing was improved mental health and improved physical health. If we get into recovery, it should show. And it does. Believe me, it does. The evidence is really convincing. Improved function, improved social, family, vocational life is part of recovery. Again, measurable, demonstrable. Life in recovery surveys in the UK, in Australia, in the United States, and Canada have all shown dramatic. And in citizenry is the word they used at Betty Ford. I like it. It's giving back. We're more likely to volunteer. One of the points that we make to government is we pay our taxes. The problem with recovery is that we're anonymous. And I know members of Alcoholics Anonymous and the tradition say at a personal level, I stay anonymous, especially my involvement with AA. But as a doctor, I know who gets the research money, who gets the government funding. It's the chronic diseases that have the loud advocacy groups, you know, that loud and proud, the gay movement changed the treatment of HIV and AIDS by being loud and proud and strong advocacy. And we're only getting Faces and Voices of Recovery, we're only wising up to that now, but it's something to think about. Look for recovery activities in your community. Treatment of addiction is simply initiation. Treatment of addiction, when somebody says our success rates are, and they offer a treatment center, what's that supposed to mean? I mean, it's like saying I treat diabetes and I give people 2 shots of insulin and send them on their way. You know, it's a chronic disease. So all good forms of treatment. Now, those of you who went to the Recovery Capital workshop yesterday, we're not going to talk about it today, but Recovery Capital is a key thing to understand. The whole point of treatment is to raise one's recovery capital, those resources, internal and external resources a person has in order to recover. And many, many of those. And all our job as treatment professionals is to help people increase the recovery capital. So over half, you're not going to believe this, but it's true. We only see the people we see. Over half of the people with addiction enter recovery without treatment on their own. Okay? Many of those don't consider themselves in recovery. They had a problem, and it was a real problem. They met the criteria for addiction, but then they had enough recovery capital. They changed things. They maybe started exercising, changed nutrition, maybe went to their pastor, maybe went whatever, joined Amway, whatever. And they got into recovery. That's over half of people with addictions. Now, it's a self-selecting thing. For the ones that didn't work, and that's pretty much everybody in this room, I would assume, well, maybe. I wouldn't have gone to AA if the first time I quit and I could feel okay. Now, I did quit, but my life got really bad really fast because I didn't have any non-chemical coping skills. So if you take away my booze and drugs, I was miserable. I remember Agnes looking at me one night, after I was a month into my white knuckle abstinence, and she said, "I don't think you're an alcoholic." And I looked at her, and said, "Why'd you say that?" And she said, "Well, look at you, you're worse." That's true. So I got up and poured a triple scotch, and of those who enter recovery, over half, and this is the Canadian Centre on Substance Abuse, Life and Recovery, over half stay sober without a single relapse. Of those who receive addiction treatment, now we're getting to the sicker people. They were sick enough to go to treatment, so they're sicker, so they're more likely to relapse. 45 to 65 will experience at least a single relapse. Of those who successfully maintain long-term recovery with alcoholism, the single most predictive factor of success is affiliation with a mutual support group. That's George Valiant's work, the largest longitudinal study. That's the Harvard study. It's been going for 65 years. Anybody who says there isn't good evidence for AA, they're just full of it. I mean, there's more and more. Since 2006, there's tons of good evidence for AA. What happens after treatment is way more important than what happens in treatment itself. Okay, so initiation of recovery, but all of those things we did afterwards are what are important. Don't have to read this, just be aware there are many, many, many proven modalities of treatment of addiction, and they all work. They all work for some people to initiate recovery. For the talking therapies, they all work pretty equally well as each other. Does anybody remember Project Match in 1996, where they took a bunch of alcoholics? Huge. It was the largest, most expensive study ever done on any psychotherapy. And they compared cognitive behavioral therapy, motivational enhancement therapy, and 12-step facilitation therapy. The 12-step facilitation was overcoming people's resistance, so they would more likely go to AA. So there was some motivational stuff in there. And they wanted to compare them. All the groups did kind of equally well in the short run, like 6 months to a year. Some counselors had really good outcomes, some had lousy outcomes. What do you think the good outcomes were? If, having told you that the therapeutic outcomes were equal, which counselors had the best outcomes? No, that was one of the myths. Sorry, I set you up for that. We all thought the people who were in recovery would get better outcomes. Not. People not in recovery did just as well. The people with the best outcomes were the ones who showed they cared, that demonstrated empathy. And again with any psychotherapy, it shows whether you're treating depression, anxiety, it's not the modality, it's the, so if you're a sponsor, if you're working with other people, if you can do empathy, AA is not treatment. Treatment implies a therapeutic relationship between two people, and AA is between equals, so it's not considered treatment. However, this next slide, if you're obsessive compulsive, is going to make you crazy. It's not meant to be read, but it's the therapeutic components, evidence-based therapies that are embedded into Alcoholics Anonymous. So when somebody says how it works, well, let's pull up a chair for a week, because there are so many components of Alcoholics Anonymous. At the very bottom of the middle column, there is spiritual conversion, persisting change. So that's one modality, and for some people that's important. But this shows you why, even without a spiritual anything, there's tons of things to get out of Alcoholics Anonymous. You can take what you like and leave the rest, but there's more and more for you. I'm not saying that everything you'll ever need is in AA. That's simply not true. AA is a kindergarten. It gets you started. And if you've got other issues, psychiatric, emotional trauma, you're going to need some outside help. And if you've got lousy boundaries, at about 5 years, you should probably start going to some Al-Anon to get better at it, because you're not going to get them as much in AA. I'm speaking from personal experience. Boundaries is one of the things that I had to learn. I taught a boundaries class for 12 years until I finally got good at them. When I first came here, Steve? Yeah, I was asking people, what does spirituality mean? Because here I was terrified about doing this talk. What do I know about spirituality? But there's 260 of us here, and I think there's about 260 definitions here. So current dictionaries talk about, it's from the Latin breath, it animates life, it's things religious or sacred, it's non-material, it gives a sense of purpose or meaning, deepest values and meanings, it's mental or emotional communion, source of power and strength. Okay, that's a pretty broad spectrum. Bill White and Alexandra Lodette did some research on spirituality, and the problem with research is there's a lack of a definition. So there's the theist and there's the non-theist approach, but then there's the heightened awareness, sense of perception, a power to heal, to empower people, subjective. So there's many components to spirituality, and they're all correct as far as I can see. Now, this is the other thing to watch out, is when people show you, this is your brain on drugs, when people show you a scan that's a SPECT scan, an fMRI or a CT scan, be a little cautious because of individual variations in neuroplasticity in the brain. The scan doesn't tell you very much. These were part of the series of Buddhist monks meditating. And when people, experienced people at prayer and meditation, do their prayer and meditation, and you scan them, sure enough, the temporal lobes, that point on the right-hand side, looks a little bit different. Something's happening in the temporal lobe, and that's about all you can say. Other studies have shown that it's not just the temporal lobes. The amygdala, the hippocampus, and other parts of the brain are involved in profound religious and spiritual experiences, more so in people. So all you can say is something in your brain changes with spirituality. I mean, it's worth doing, and I find that the longer I spend meditating and working on mindfulness, I think I'm getting benefits from it, you know. Maybe it's placebo, but I'm going to keep doing it. This is a really important thing. This came from the Canadian Life and Recovery Survey. There were 855 respondents, and one of the questions was, what are the things that were important in motivating you to start recovery, and what were the important things later for maintenance? And the top three were quality of life, mental and emotional health, and marriage and family for initiating, and they remained important for maintaining. But if you look way down, second from the bottom, for getting into recovery, initiating religious and spiritual, that was only 15%. But for maintaining, it's 47%. Two important things here for this group. That means over half of them, that was only 47%. For over half of people in recovery, they say it's not important. But to 47%, it is important. And if we're going to be a big tent, we have to acknowledge that. Nothing new here. The horizontal is time. The vertical is recovery capital and quality of life. Pink cloud, things get really good really fast, and then they don't for a while. And then with personal growth and in Ladette's work, she's looking at, Alexandra Ladette is looking at spiritual seeking along this period of later stages of recovery. But the quality of life improves with time. And one of the, for me, the important point is that it doesn't seem to stop. As long as I'm willing to keep working at it, it doesn't seem to stop. Carl Jung on the left, or Jung, Spiritus Contra Spiritum. Everybody knows that quote in the correspondence with Bill W., that for something strong enough to resist the compulsion to alcohol, for some people, and I think he was talking about Ebby, was it? That he needed some kind of spiritual conversion because he was out of, nothing else was seeming to work. And then William James, the only radical therapy I know for dipsomania is religiomania, and that's in varieties of, they didn't have as many therapeutic tools. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. I'd love to just discard the psychedelic drug experimenters. But you know what the evidence shows? All of these drugs, LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, ibogaine, all of these drugs, they all have evidence that for multiple types of addiction, drug addictions, they are effective in some people. But remember, treatment is initiation. So is there a place for them? Hell, I don't know. I don't know. But I beg your pardon? Yeah, we were going to pass out samples at the end. Last time I did that, I didn't get them all back though. This is Bill. I'm certain that the LSD experiment has helped me very much. I find myself with a heightened color perception and appreciation of beauty almost destroyed by my years of depression. Bill Wilson, 1957. As we know, he experimented. He was part of the LSD experiments here in Canada. So the evidence that spirituality increases from pre to post recovery is pretty strong. And we saw that with our Canadian Life and Recovery Survey. In recovering people, higher levels of religious faith and spirituality are associated with more positive health outcomes, more optimistic life orientation, higher resilience to stress, lower anxiety, improved coping ability. That's what he says. Empirical studies on association of religiosity and 12-step participation show that extent of religious affiliation does not affect the benefits derived from 12-step participation. So, as we know, I don't have to tell you that it doesn't affect your outcome if you choose not to get involved with the spiritual or religious side of things. And meeting attendance is much less predictive of success than program involvement. So people who actually work the steps, do service work, have a sponsor and use a sponsor, have better outcomes than people who just go to meetings. And there's evidence. So what's our take home? from all of this. Our disease is complex. So it's more than just one of neurobiology, behavior, character, spirituality, emotional status, and trauma. It truly is biopsychosocial spiritual. And so if you're a reductionist, if you really want things to be black and white, just remember that's a cognitive distortion. Cognitive therapy is black and white thinking. And I know, when I first came out of treatment, black and white thinking was really important to me. If anybody was down on AA, I wanted to kill them. You know, because it felt personally threatening. But as we mature, as we grow through it, we have to be pluralistic. We have to have this big tent. We have to say there are many different pathways, and they're all valid pathways. Abstinence is simply the key to the doorway to the journey of recovery. So although it's not in itself the thing, for most of us, it's essential to get through the door. Treatment of addiction is sometimes needed, but it only helps with initiation. It's the beginning of the journey. And I don't know if we're learning that one yet or not. There are many pathways, many tools that work to keep us on our never-ending journey. So, and yet I was on antidepressants, and I for many years, I felt kind of embarrassed about it. Every fall, I'd go back on them. Around September the 10th, my family doctor pointed it out to me. I would end up getting help. And finally, in 2005, after a heart scare, see, I was a couch potato. I thought joggers were nuts. I thought I've only got so many heartbeats, and I'll be damned if I'm going to waste them doing something as stupid as that. And I got a cardiac test done showing that I had moderate heart disease. And so my daughter and my wife took me running, and I hated it. But I went in my first race, and I was hooked. And so I've done 8 consecutive Boston marathons and 2 Ironmans, and God knows how many have. But I haven't taken antidepressants since. For me, exercise is just one of the key pieces for my puzzle. Not for everybody, it's not as important, but for me, it was absolutely essential for staying well. But I do a lot of other stuff as well. Spiritual and religious activities are important and effective for many, but not all people in recovery. So, those are my grandkids. They're now 20 months old, and their mom grew up in the program. She doesn't even know how much AA she uses in her relationships and in her parenting. They're living with us right now. If you want these slides, I'm just going to, and these are the references, some of the references, there's many more. But if you want the slides, that's my email, and I'll send them to you if you want them. I'll take out some of the bigger, it gets about 12 megabytes, so it's too big to send by email. But thank you.
Ray, I actually got to hear the session. I would have been rolling around, and that was just fabulous. Thank you very much, Ray, for helping us. I just wanted to let you know about the rest of the day. I know some people are leaving a bit early, but we have a full program this afternoon. We now are dispersing. You have lunch on your own. At registration, you got lists of things in the area or in the food court over in the Eaton Center. We come back here at 1 o'clock, and we have sessions here and in the breakout rooms until 4 o'clock. I think that's it for now. There's coffee now. That's probably the end of the coffee, but we'll see how it's going. And anything else, come and see me. We'll see you back here at 1 o'clock. Thank you again.
This talk was recorded at the Toronto Marriott Eaton Centre. For more information and more recordings, visit seculara.org.